Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Schumerth, and this is episode 18 of Rudy's Bench. The Notre Dame football team has now used up its second bye weekend, and if we circled weekends we expect it to be important for this team, the upcoming matchup against Florida State most certainly would have been one of them. But that was from the expectations of last year's undefeated during the regular season Seminole team. This year, they've gotten off to an astonishing 1-7 start, which certainly doesn't mean they wouldn't love to beat Notre Dame, but College game day isn't going to be in South Bend for it. We discussed on the podcast a couple weeks back some of Notre Dame's rivals, and while the Irish don't play Florida State every year, so maybe they don't quite get put into the same category as USC or even Michigan a few years back, there have been some good ones over the years against the Seminoles. We've talked about the 2014 offensive pass interference game in Tallahassee, and we've talked about the Thomas Krug 1996 Orange Bowl game. Florida State won both of those ones, but one they didn't win was the 1993 so-called game of the century. Lou Holtz versus Bobby Bowden, number 2 versus number 1 in South Bend. Today, I'm grateful to be talking with Malcolm Moran. As a sports reporter for the likes of the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and USA Today, Malcolm covered Notre Dame for the better part of 25 years, including that game against Florida State in 1993. Malcolm, thanks so much for taking the time to talk a little bit about the Irish.
Hi, Chris. Good to be with you. And I also, for the sake of perspective, covered a far less discussed game, which was in '81, the beginning of the Jerry Faust era. And one of the early signs that this might not be working out, because Florida State was running a gauntlet of a schedule that had been left to Bowden by an athletic director who was no longer there. And as hard as this might be to envision Florida State being in this position, I mean, they were looking for bye games. And there was a 5-game stretch that included at Nebraska. This is when Nebraska was at its peak in the Osborne era. At Ohio State, at LSU, at Notre Dame, at Pittsburgh when Pitt had Dan Marino and was in the top 5. And Bowden being Bowden, he put a happy face on it by calling it Oktoberfest. But one of the early steps was Florida State won that game in South Bend. And it was not the very beginning of the rumblings, but it was a very early stage. So to go from 81 to 93, when Florida State is not only catching up, but is really considered an equal, just added to the buildup of that game.
I think I noticed in something I read of yours, was that game that you just referred to, was that the first time the two teams had ever played?
I suspect it was.
So let's talk about not just the game yet in 93, but the lead up to the game. I suspect it wasn't exactly wine and cheese club that week. What was the sentiment and the feeling in South Bend before that game against Florida State?
The first thing that would be important to cover in terms of any context is that, for example, ESPN Game Day as an influencer, even though that term wasn't used then, was in its very early stages, because that game was the first time that Game Day went on the road. The Game Day crew was actually indoors, was not outside. It was in a hallway in the Joyce Center, in between the basketball arena and the other side of the facility. That was a time when there were probably at least 15 people working for different papers across the country that covered college football on a regular basis, not as beat reporters for a specific team, but as either national or regional college football reporters. And so there was so much intense interest in that group, plus the locals from both areas, that there were people in Tallahassee the weekend before, including me. And then from the early part of that week on, there were people descending in South Bend. Rather than getting in on Thursday or Friday, they were getting there Sunday or Monday, or in the case of those of us that had been in Tallahassee, we got out Monday night so that we could attend the Tuesday press conference, the regular availability with Holtz. And this will be related to another story that I can share about that week. But Notre Dame, which then had an SID operation that was the equal of anybody in the country, actually created the equivalent of an NCAA basketball tournament type press room that had working spaces, desk after desk, part of the area where you could get any statistical reference material you wanted, a small theater style interview area, and they would just work within the players' class schedules and just have players rotating in all day long. And so each day, starting on Monday, Notre Dame and Florida State were both providing the kind of access that met the demand. And so on a national basis, you were reading something new about that game every day that week. And in fact, the buildup had started earlier. I remember it was probably 3 weeks earlier. Notre Dame had a pretty easy time with SC. That was when John Robinson was in his second tenure there. And Robinson comes into the media area for the press conference after the game. And the first thing he said was it okay to talk about Notre Dame, Florida State now? It's the SC coach asking the question that we were all thinking. That's the kind of buildup that game created. And the events of the week just kept going. And one of the first things I remember noticing in Tallahassee, and this would have been probably Monday morning or early afternoon, they're rotating players in too, so that they're players not so much in a formal setting, it's just a small group. There might be 8 to 10 of us sitting around a player. And one theme that seemed to be emerging was that Florida State guys were joking about this game. And they were making references to Rock Newtony, which seemed to be some kind of inside joke among them, maybe. And I remember vividly listening to this banter and thinking, you know what, Florida State might be better. Florida State might be the best team in the country, likely Heisman winner at quarterback. Florida State probably has a significant edge in speed going into this matchup. But at some point, they're going to get hit in the mouth. And I don't know that they know that yet.
Can you share, if you can't, that's okay, but you have an anecdote that suggests that maybe even the Notre Dame coach knew something or other about their ability to hit Florida State in the mouth.
Sure. It was one of the more memorable things in all my time covering college football. I explained earlier how Notre Dame had created from scratch this NCAA tournament quality press room that made our jobs infinitely simpler and more convenient. The only downside to it was there was a converted practice basketball gym. To get to the space, you had to go through this corridor that was filled with old discarded file cabinets and old rolled up carpeting. It was like a storage area. And you got to navigate through this thing to get to this high level operation. The first day that Lou Holtz comes through there for the daily press conference, he's appalled that all these people are coming to Notre Dame and we're trying to put our best foot forward and we subject them to this gauntlet just so that they can do their jobs. So Lou on his own decides that on Thursday night, we're coming over for takeout barbecue. And so he has to inform Beth. And so the way he decided to do it was to call his aide de camp, George Kelly, God rest his soul, who had been a coach on the Parsegian staff going back to the 60s, had coached earlier on at Nebraska, highly respected in the industry, and now he had moved into athletic administration beyond coaching. And so Lou has George call Beth to deliver the news. And so George is telling this story later on. And, hey, Beth, it's George. Oh, hi, George. How are you? Beth, have I ever told you that you're the most wonderful person in the world? What does he want, George? And it's now George's task to inform Beth that about 75 of the great unwashed are coming over for takeout barbecue. So it's Thursday night, and we get directions to the Holtz's house. And we had heard that the house rule was that any memorabilia, any sports related stuff was limited to the basement. And we had heard about that, but none of us had ever seen it. Now we're seeing it, and it's true. And to my surprise, as a Jets kid growing up in the Super Bowl era, there was this huge picture of him and Joe Namath on a sideline. And he only lasted with the Jets less than one season. He left with, I think, 2, maybe 3 games left in the 76 season. And to see that so prominently displayed when he had done all these other things, including what had happened at Notre Dame, really took me by surprise. So he was the perfect host. Oh, and that night, by the way, is what qualified Beth for sainthood at whatever point in the future that conversation will take place. But Lou is the perfect host, and he's standing behind this bar in the basement, and he's pouring glasses of wine for the guests. And BYU is playing somebody on Thursday night. And it gets to halftime. And of course, like everybody else, all they're talking about is Florida State Notre Dame, which at this point is that Saturday afternoon. This is Thursday night. So people are getting into town other than writers. Now the fans are arriving and the buildup is in full bloom. And they have a soundbite from the Tuesday press conference in which Holtz said, Florida State is capable of scoring 50 points every time they take the field. And nobody says a word. And every eye in the basement goes from the Lou on the TV to the Lou pouring Chardonnay behind the bar. Nobody says a word. And he finally says, I said they were capable of it. I didn't say they would. And that's when I realized he believes. It wasn't in response to a question. And that's the way he worked. And I understand the whole poor mouthing thing. That was very real. But I think the structure of his work week that was overlooked when people would make fun of him for talking about being concerned about Rice's special teams was that early in the week, he was just driven by detail, and he is trying to identify anything that could go wrong. And that's the focus of the week. And as the week would go along, between film preparation, office preparation, practice, the confidence level would go up until the end of the week. They're ready to play. Just out of necessity, we would get him on Tuesday around lunchtime. And I truly believe, as crazy as this may sound, that either the day before or maybe that morning when they're playing Rice, he had seen something on film about Rice's special teams that just checked a box in his head saying, we need to address this. And then it comes out at the press conference and everybody's saying, Lou, what are you trying to feed us? But he was one of the more interesting people I've ever been around in just trying to understand methodology and how he worked, how his mind worked. But by Thursday night, he felt comfortable enough, even though I don't know if anybody ever said this is off the record. I don't think that was the case. People were free to write whatever they wanted about it. But clearly he was of a mindset by Thursday night where he thought they were ready to go. And then Friday, you're into the rubber chicken lunch and then the pep rally. And now the whole production of a Notre Dame football weekend is up and running. And that was one of the most memorable.
I have a question, but I want to start with my version of some of this. First of all, I've said on the podcast before that this game, the 1993 Notre Dame versus Florida State, was actually the first game that I remember watching. So I actually grew up without a TV until I was in high school, but sometimes my dad would take us to work or to a restaurant, to watch, in particular, Notre Dame football games. And this one, we went to a friend of his. And throughout the game, his friend, whenever Notre Dame scores, is picking up the phone and dialing his girlfriend, who either must have hated Notre Dame or was a Florida State fan, one of the two. And so that is my memory of this game. And of course, they win that game, and then I'm hooked in all the wrong ways. And of course, maybe we'll even get to the week following. So you get the extreme high and then the extreme low. But what do you think that Lou, if we try to get in his head, knew or saw? And I'll tack on to that. I watched an extended version of the highlights last night, and it is an interesting game. And you profiled, I believe, both quarterbacks, Charlie Ward, who would win the Heisman and weirdly go on to an NBA career, and Kevin McDougal, who was an afterthought, really. He wouldn't even have been playing in the game if Ron Paulus hadn't gotten hurt. And I looked at the stats. Kevin McDougal had 108 passing yards. And of course, Charlie Ward put the ball in the air 50 times. And even though they were down, literally, they were down 14 with 2 minutes to go. And then the last play of the game is on the 14 or the 15-yard line, and it gets batted down by Sean Wooden. But your language of punched in the mouth, Lee Becton certainly seems like he had a pretty good game. So they were able to run the ball against Florida State. Florida State has the better weapons, maybe the better speed. They have the superior quarterback. How was Notre Dame able to win that day?
The running game was the bread and butter. And now I don't remember in the lead up if there was much discussion of weather that week, but wind was an issue. Now, obviously, it didn't affect Charlie that much because he was pretty effective. But I do remember there were times when Florida State had some problems with the elements, specifically wind. I think that played a factor. And I have no doubt that in one way or another, that staff was getting ready for Charlie Ward for weeks, maybe even starting in the summertime. And with good reason, because if you were going to rate Heisman winners just in terms of things like creativity and just being a dynamic presence, Ward is as good as anybody. He would be on any short list. And he presented, whether it was his vision, his awareness, his understanding of the offense, and his ability to improvise, he was probably as tough to deal with as anybody in that generation.
Why didn't he play in the NFL?
I think given what we know now, the reports about CTE and how people's lives have been affected, I think he was at the early edge of that level of concern and that decision-making process. And I mean, he wasn't the Heisman equivalent in basketball, but he was a very good player for a very good team playing in a tough league. So I think he recognized that as a professional decision, that was a really good way to go.
And then we have, let's see, what was your language? The kick that will not come down, I think it was. The following week, Notre Dame, they're able to get by Florida State, and then they lose to Boston College, who is another rival of Notre Dame's. This happens a lot in sports where you have a big win followed by a big loss. It certainly happened to Notre Dame earlier this year when they beat Texas A&M on the road, and then they came back home and lost to Northern Illinois. But I assume, since I saw that article, that you were also there for the Boston College game. Can you attempt to describe the emotional deflation of that moment?
I'm glad you asked, because this point, to me, is one of the most misunderstood and underappreciated elements that has to do with major college football, specifically sports in general, but football especially, just because of the physical nature of that level of play. We've seen it happen in the college football playoff. We're probably going to see it happen with the expanded field. People don't understand the immense physical and emotional cost of a game like that, where it's not a question of playing hard. You are expending every ounce of effort, mentally and physically, that you have to reach an objective. And we're talking about 18 to 23-year-olds who are supposed to turn around 7 or 8 days later and do it all over again. And I remember after the game on the Sunday morning, and I'm paraphrasing, but this was the point that Lou made, that he knew that they were going to have to play through that against BC. And that his hope was at some point they'll just be able to push through whatever you want to say to describe it. And in fact, they did. But people just don't understand. We saw it happen with TCU beating Michigan straight up in a semifinal game and then just getting drilled by Georgia, not because of a lack of effort or anything like that. There was nothing left in the tank. And I think that's what we saw with Notre Dame. There was nothing left in the tank. The shame of it is the comeback that Kevin McDougal engineered would have gone down as one of the great comebacks and immortal moments in the history of the institution if that wound up helping them reach another national championship. It was like video game stuff where he leads them back. And then it ended the way it ended with a knuckleball kick from a place kicker that had his ups and downs. And it actually, BC fans rolled their eyes when they were considering that it was going to come down to his foot. I remember the next day when the morning after thing with Holtz, Aaron Taylor just coming in to get some work done, and just the look of emptiness in his eyes. There was nothing formal. There were no interviews with him on Sunday, but just seeing him and just the sense of total deflation that had gone through that program. And for BC fans, it was sweet because the year before they had played in South Bend and gotten pushed around. And BC people were upset because Notre Dame, with a big lead late, had tried a fake punt that Lou, I think he said that there was something that they needed to work on. You could raise the question of how wise that is when you're drilling an opponent that views you as a rival, even if you don't view them as a rival. But yeah, I remember feeling badly for them because it's very hard to describe how difficult the challenge is to turn around a week later when the stakes are really just as high for them. But like you were going to have that inevitable drop off. And as it turned out, that's when they lost the chance to play for a championship.
Can you explain a little bit about how bowl game selection worked and how the national champion was chosen at that time? Obviously, we eventually got the bowl championship series, which moved to a 4-game playoff, which now is moving to a 12-game playoff. But one of the things that as a kid I remember about that is just feeling this great injustice, because I believe Florida State, in a technical sense, was voted the national champion that year. They won out. Notre Dame lost to Boston College, and they ended up finishing with one loss. How did that work?
You got an hour? Actually, it's an interesting question because that was the period that began the pivot that would eventually lead to what we have today. I think the people in the bowl industry had begun to realize that the national acceptance for this kind of quirky, let me back up a second. From the early eras of the Rose Bowl obviously coming first, and then sugar, orange, cotton in the 30s, there was a charm to the bowl season because it was almost looked upon as separate from the regular season. It was a curtain call. It was a chance to go someplace warm and root for your team. Until the late 60s, the final Associated Press poll, media poll, took place before the bowl games. So you could be declared a national champion and lose a high-profile bowl game in the final game. I remember one in particular. Alabama is viewed as the 1964 national champion and lost to Texas in the Orange Bowl when, if you ask Joe Namath to this day, he'll tell you he broke the plane, but the officials just didn't call it. Texas beats Alabama, but Alabama was still considered the national champion. I think the people that ran the bowl industry were getting clear signals that their audience and, by extension, their television partners wanted something more. And in the early 90s, that's when you had the first baby steps toward an effort at first to bring together the perceived number one against number two. It had taken place through the system, most famously with the Penn State-Miami game in the '87 Fiesta, when both were independents and when NBC was willing to work with the Fiesta Bowl to move the game off of January 1 to the evening of January 2, which was a Friday night. And that was really the template that would lead to what we have now. In the early 90s, and I always get mixed up whether it was the Bowl Alliance that was first and then the Bowl Coalition, or the Bowl Coalition that was first and then the Bowl Alliance, but it was the first structured effort to try to bring together the two top-ranked teams, understanding that there were some years where contracts with specific bowls and conferences would make that impossible. So in this case, when Florida State comes away with the victory in South Bend, Notre Dame at that point is not viewed as a national championship contender by a lot of people, even though people supporting Notre Dame felt, wait a minute, look, we have one loss. It was by a field goal in a narrow game on the last play of the game. Wait a minute, we're still in this. In terms of the national media response, the Florida State-Nebraska game was viewed as the national championship game. Now, I know a lot of Irish fans would vehemently disagree with that, and certainly there's a valid case to be made, but that's the way it was viewed. And Florida State hangs on when Nebraska tries a late field goal attempt that was no good. Osborne was denied the first national championship of his time as coach of the Huskers. Bowden wins one, and that's how that season ended. It would have been interesting if Notre Dame had beaten BC from the point literally a few minutes after Charlie Ward's last pass had been knocked down in the end zone. The debate started whether people had an appetite for a rematch in the Fiesta Bowl. And already people were taking sides. There were some people that said, let's tee it up and do it again. There were other people that said, hey, we know who won this game. Let's get another matchup. But it became a moot point.
There are a lot of other directions we could go. You were a beat writer during the Bob Davie years. You broke the Kim Dunbar story.
Not the scandal story, but the story that I did have first was the outcome in terms of NCAA sanctions, which were announced the week before Christmas week. It was the last week of the fall semester in '99, and the announcement was made on the Friday, and I was able to confirm it Wednesday night. In those days, the Tribune did not put stories like that on the website right away because the feeling was, and this is how we could see how much the business has changed, the thinking at that point, and hard to believe we're talking almost 25 years ago, was why would we post this story at 9:00 Central and give our competition a chance to pretend that they caught up? Like, we're going to break this the way we've been doing it for 100 years when people go to the newsstand tomorrow morning. Now, a short number of years after that, it wouldn't have been done that way. But I had the information and wrote it early Wednesday evening Central Time. It appeared on the Thursday print edition, and then the press conference was Friday.
Like I said, I could fire a lot more questions maybe another time. I think it'd be really interesting. And it seems like you've covered some of the Notre Dame decision making along the way about conference selection and staying independent and whether or not there might still be a full conference membership in front of them. But I want to be respectful of your time today. Thank you so much for joining and for sharing some of your experience.
It was one of the most memorable, not just regular season games, but any college football game I've been able to see in person. Thank you for having me. I'd be happy to do it again. It'd be nice if there was a way that the Irish could be in Pasadena 100 years later. That would be pretty sweet to see gold helmets with sun reflecting off them at 2:00 Pacific on New Year's Day. I think there'd be a few eyeballs tracking that if they were able to reach a quarterfinal game.
I will take you up on that. This has been another episode of the Rudy's Bench podcast. We care here about the wins and losses, and we're also interested in the role that sports play in our lives.